The sound of laughter echoed across the military training ground as Sarah Martinez stepped onto the obstacle course. 23 years old, barely 5'4" tall, and weighing less than most of the gear these Marines carried into battle. To them, she looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. "This is who they sent to evaluate our combat readiness?" whispered Sergeant Thompson, nudging his buddy with an elbow.
My little sister could probably outrun her. The snickers grew louder when Sarah began stretching. Her movements precise but seemingly delicate compared to the raw power these battle-hardened soldiers were used to.
They had no idea they were watching someone who had spent the last 5 years quietly revolutionizing how America's most elite warriors prepared for the impossible.
What happened next would not only silence their mockery, but completely change how they understood what real strength looked like. Because sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody sees coming. This is the true story of how one woman's unconventional path led her to train the most elite military units in the world, and how a group of skeptical Marines learned that their assumptions about strength, skill, and leadership were about to be completely shattered. Sarah Martinez had never planned to revolutionize military training. Growing up in a small town in Arizona, she was the daughter of a high school math teacher and a nurse who worked night shifts at the local hospital. Her childhood was filled with books, not battles, and her biggest physical challenge was convincing her parents to let her join the school's cross-country team. But Sarah possessed something that couldn't be taught in any classroom or training manual: an extraordinary ability to see patterns where others saw chaos, and to find solutions that others missed entirely. This gift first revealed itself during her freshman year at Arizona State University, where she was studying exercise physiology with dreams of becoming a physical therapist. The university's ROTC program was struggling. Their cadets were failing physical fitness tests at alarming rates, and morale had hit rock bottom. Traditional training methods weren't working, and the instructors were running out of ideas. When Sarah volunteered to help as part of a research project for a biomechanics class, nobody expected much from the quiet student with thick-rimmed glasses and a notebook that never left her side. Sarah spent weeks observing the ROTC training sessions, taking notes that seemed meaningless to everyone else. She watched how cadets moved, when they failed, what caused them to give up. While the instructors focused on pushing harder and demanding more, Sarah was studying the science behind why their bodies were breaking down and their minds were shutting off. Her breakthrough came during a particularly brutal training session. She watched a promising cadet named Marcus struggle through what should have been a simple rope climb. He had the strength and determination, but something was wrong with his technique. The instructors yelled louder, demanding he try harder, but Sarah could see the real problem. His breathing pattern was fighting against his movement, and his grip was creating unnecessary tension throughout his entire body. That evening, Sarah approached Marcus privately and asked if she could show him something different. What she taught him in 20 minutes transformed his performance completely. The next day, he completed the rope climb effortlessly, and word began to spread among the cadets that the quiet girl with the notebook had some kind of magic touch. But it wasn't magic. It was science, psychology, and an intuitive understanding of how the human body and mind worked together under stress. Sarah had developed a training philosophy that focused on efficiency over brute force, mental preparation over physical punishment, and sustainable growth over quick fixes that led to burnout and injury. Her methods were unconventional, sometimes even controversial. Instead of screaming at cadets who were struggling, she would quietly analyze their movement patterns and offer subtle adjustments that transformed their performance. Instead of adding more weight or more repetitions when someone hit a plateau, she would often reduce the intensity and focus on perfecting technique until the breakthrough naturally occurred. The ROTC program's fitness test scores improved dramatically over the following semester. More importantly, the cadets were developing a different relationship with physical and mental challenges. They were learning to see obstacles not as punishments to endure, but as problems to solve intelligently. Word of Sarah's success reached beyond the university. A retired Navy SEAL instructor who was consulting with various military training programs heard about the dramatic improvements in the ROTC unit and decided to investigate. Commander James Patterson had seen every training method imaginable during his 20-year career, and he was skeptical that a college student could offer anything revolutionary. When Patterson first met Sarah, his skepticism only deepened. She didn't look like any trainer he had ever worked with. She didn't speak in military jargon or demonstrate her methods by showing off impressive physical feats. Instead, she spoke quietly about biomechanics, stress response patterns, and the psychology of performance under pressure. Patterson agreed to let Sarah work with a small group of struggling SEAL candidates, more out of curiosity than genuine belief in her methods. These were men who were on the verge of being dropped from the program, soldiers who had the heart and determination but were failing the physical and mental demands of SEAL training. Sarah approached these elite candidates the same way she had approached the ROTC cadets, with careful observation, scientific analysis, and an understanding that each person's path to excellence was unique. She didn't try to change their basic training routine, but she introduced small modifications that had enormous impact. She taught them breathing techniques that prevented panic during underwater exercises. She showed them movement patterns that reduced injury risk during heavy carrying exercises. Most importantly, she helped them understand their own mental responses to extreme stress, giving them tools to maintain clarity and focus when their instincts were screaming at them to quit. The results were extraordinary. All but one of the struggling candidates who worked with Sarah successfully completed SEAL training. More than that, they were graduating with higher marks and fewer injuries than candidates who had seemed much more promising at the beginning of the program. Commander Patterson was amazed, but he was also puzzled. Sarah's methods worked, but they didn't fit any of the traditional models he understood. She wasn't a drill sergeant who motivated through intimidation. She wasn't a fitness expert who focused on building maximum strength or endurance. She was something entirely different, and Patterson realized that the military needed to understand what she was doing. The invitation to work with the Navy came during Sarah's senior year of college. Instead of the physical therapy program she had originally planned, she was offered an opportunity to develop training protocols for some of the military's most challenging programs. It was a chance to take her methods from the university level to the highest levels of military preparation. Sarah's parents were concerned about their daughter entering such a masculine, aggressive world. They worried that she would be overwhelmed or pushed aside by career military officers who might not respect her unconventional background. But Sarah saw something they didn't: an opportunity to prove that intelligence and understanding could be just as powerful as traditional strength and aggression. Her first official assignment was to evaluate and improve training protocols for various special operations units. It was a role that required her to work with different branches of the military, each with their own culture, traditions, and resistance to change. The Marines in particular were known for their skepticism toward outsiders, especially those who didn't fit the traditional military mold. When Sarah received orders to evaluate a Marine training unit at Camp Pendleton, she knew she would face her biggest challenge yet. These weren't college students looking for help with fitness tests. These were battle-hardened professionals who had survived some of the most intense training and combat experiences imaginable. The day before her arrival at Camp Pendleton, Sarah spent hours preparing herself mentally for what she knew would be a hostile reception. She understood that she would have to prove herself not just once, but repeatedly, and that every interaction would be a test of her competence and credibility. She packed her usual equipment, notebooks filled with research, video equipment for movement analysis, and biometric monitoring devices that could track stress responses in real time. But she also packed something else: an unshakable confidence in the science behind her methods, and a determination to show these Marines that excellence could be achieved through intelligence and understanding, not just through raw willpower and aggression. As her plane descended towards San Diego, Sarah looked out the window at the sprawling military base below and knew that her life was about to change dramatically. She had no idea that within a few hours she would be facing down a group of skeptical Marines who were about to learn that their assumptions about strength, training, and leadership were completely wrong. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge everything these warriors thought they knew about what it meant to be truly elite. And at the center of it all was a young woman who looked like she belonged in a laboratory, not on a battlefield, but who was about to prove that sometimes the most powerful weapon is the one nobody sees coming. The California sun was already blazing when Sarah's rental car pulled through the gates of Camp Pendleton. The Marine base sprawled across 125,000 acres of Southern California coastline, a massive complex of training facilities, barracks, and operational centers that had been forging warriors for over 8 decades. As she drove through the base, Sarah could see Marines running in formation, the sound of their synchronized footfalls carrying across the morning air. Staff Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez was waiting for her at the headquarters building, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes clearly skeptical. At 42, Rodriguez had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and had seen every type of trainer, consultant, and expert the military could produce. When he looked at Sarah stepping out of her car in civilian clothes, carrying what appeared to be camera equipment and a laptop bag, his first thought was that someone in Washington had made a serious mistake. The briefing room was filled with 12 Marines, all senior non-commissioned officers who had been selected to evaluate Sarah's methods. These were men who had survived everything from urban warfare to mountain operations, and their combined experience represented over 200 years of military service. When Sarah walked into the room, the conversation stopped, and she could feel the weight of their collective judgment settling on her shoulders. Captain David Morgan, the unit commander, made the introductions with military efficiency. At 38, Morgan had earned his reputation through a combination of tactical brilliance and unwavering dedication to his Marines. He had requested this evaluation reluctantly, under pressure from higher command, and his body language made it clear that he considered it a waste of time. Sarah had learned to read rooms like this during her work with the SEALs, but the Marine culture was different. Where Navy personnel might express skepticism through questions or challenges, Marines seemed to communicate their doubts through silence and carefully controlled expressions. The message was clear: prove yourself or get out. Instead of beginning with a presentation or explanation of her methods, Sarah did something unexpected. She asked Captain Morgan if she could observe their normal training routine without making any changes or suggestions. She wanted to understand their current methods before proposing anything different. For the next 3 hours, Sarah sat quietly on the sidelines of the training ground, watching as the Marines worked through combat fitness tests, obstacle courses, and tactical exercises. Her notebook filled with observations that seemed incomprehensible to anyone watching her. Breathing patterns during sprints, foot placement during rope climbs, eye movement during stress drills. What Sarah saw both impressed and concerned her. These Marines were undoubtedly tough, mentally and physically prepared for combat in ways that most people could never imagine. But she also noticed inefficiencies and stress patterns that were limiting their potential and setting them up for long-term injuries. During a break, Corporal James Washington approached her. Washington was 26 years old, had served 2 deployments in Iraq, and was known throughout the unit for his exceptional physical conditioning. He was also struggling with a chronic shoulder injury that threatened to end his career, and he was curious about this civilian who was watching them so intently. "Ma'am," Washington said, his tone respectful but cautious, "I don't mean any disrespect, but what exactly are you looking for out here? Because if you're planning to tell us how to do our jobs better, I think you should know that we've been doing this for a while." Sarah smiled, recognizing both the challenge and the genuine curiosity in his voice. "I'm not here to tell you how to do your jobs," she replied. "I'm here to see if there might be ways to help you do them more effectively and with less risk of injury." "Can I ask you about that shoulder?" Washington's surprise was evident. He hadn't mentioned his injury to anyone, and his movement compensations were subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice them. But Sarah had spotted the slight favoring of his right side, the minor adjustment in his arm position during certain exercises. "How did you know about that?" Washington asked, his defensive posture softening slightly. "The way you modify your movement during overhead exercises," Sarah explained. "Your body is naturally protecting the injured area, but the compensation pattern you've developed is putting extra stress on your lower back and hip. In 6 months, you're going to have problems there too if we don't address the original issue." This prediction hit Washington like a punch. He had indeed been experiencing some lower back discomfort recently, but he had assumed it was unrelated to his shoulder problem. The fact that this civilian had identified the connection in less than 3 hours of observation was both impressive and unsettling. Word of Sarah's interaction with Washington spread quickly through the unit. When the Marines reassembled for the afternoon training session, there was a subtle shift in their attitude. The outright skepticism had evolved into wary curiosity. Sarah asked Captain Morgan if she could work individually with any Marines who were interested in exploring different approaches to their training challenges. She emphasized that participation would be completely voluntary and that she wasn't trying to replace their existing methods, just supplement them with additional tools. To everyone's surprise, including his own, Corporal Washington volunteered first. His shoulder problem had been limiting his performance for months, and traditional military medicine had offered him little beyond rest and pain management. If this unusual consultant had insights that could help him maintain his career, he was willing to listen. Sarah's session with Washington lasted only 30 minutes, but it transformed his understanding of his own body. Instead of focusing on strengthening his shoulder directly, she taught him breathing techniques that reduced overall tension, movement patterns that engaged his core more effectively, and visualization exercises that helped him move with greater confidence and control. The changes were immediate and obvious. Washington's overhead reach improved dramatically, and for the first time in months, he completed the exercise without pain. More importantly, he understood why the techniques worked, which gave him the tools to continue improving on his own. By the end of the first day, 3 more Marines had requested individual sessions with Sarah. Sergeant Rodriguez, despite his initial skepticism, was beginning to see that this consultant might have something valuable to offer his men. The real test came on the second day, when Captain Morgan challenged Sarah to demonstrate her methods with the unit's most physically demanding exercise, the combat fitness test that every Marine had to pass regularly throughout their career. This test included ammunition can lifts, maneuver under fire simulations, and a 3-mile run, all performed under time pressure and designed to simulate combat stress. Sarah accepted the challenge, but with one condition. She wanted to work with the Marines who had performed worst on their last test, not the best. This surprised everyone, as most consultants preferred to work with top performers to showcase their methods. The 3 Marines she selected were all struggling with different aspects of the test. Private First Class Danny Chen was failing the ammunition can lifts due to grip strength issues. Lance Corporal Marcus Thompson couldn't maintain his pace during the 3-mile run. Sergeant Mike Johnson was having trouble with the maneuver under fire exercise because of balance and coordination problems. Instead of putting these Marines through additional physical training, Sarah spent most of her time teaching them to understand their own bodies and minds. She showed Chen that his grip failures weren't due to weak hands, but to unnecessary tension throughout his entire upper body that was exhausting his grip muscles prematurely. She taught Thompson breathing techniques that allowed him to maintain consistent pace and energy throughout long runs. She helped Johnson identify the visual and mental cues that were disrupting his balance during complex movement patterns. The results of their next combat fitness test were remarkable. Chen not only passed the ammunition can portion, he achieved his personal best score. Thompson completed his run 2 minutes faster than his previous time. Johnson moved through the maneuver under fire exercise with a smoothness and confidence that impressed even the most skeptical observers. But the real breakthrough came when these 3 Marines began sharing what they had learned with their fellow unit members. Without any prompting from Sarah, they started helping other Marines identify and correct their own performance limitations. The techniques Sarah had taught them were spreading organically throughout the unit. This peer-to-peer learning was exactly what Sarah had hoped to achieve. Her methods were most effective when they became part of a unit's culture, not when they were imposed from outside. The Marines were taking ownership of these new approaches and adapting them to their own needs and circumstances. Captain Morgan was forced to acknowledge that something significant was happening in his unit. Marines who had been struggling with chronic performance issues were suddenly breaking through barriers they had been fighting for months. More importantly, they were doing it without additional equipment, extended training time, or major changes to their existing routines. On the 3rd day, Morgan asked Sarah to address the entire unit together. This was both an opportunity and a test. If she could win over the group as a whole, her methods might become a permanent part of their training program. If she failed to connect with them, her individual successes would likely be dismissed as isolated incidents. Sarah stood before the assembled Marines, knowing that this moment would determine whether her revolutionary approach to training would be accepted or rejected by one of the military's most traditional and skeptical communities. The next few minutes would either validate everything she had worked for or send her back to the drawing board. She looked out at faces that ranged from curious to hostile, and she knew that her next words would have to be chosen very carefully. These warriors had spent their careers believing in certain truths about strength, toughness, and preparation for combat. She was about to ask them to consider that some of those truths might be incomplete. The silence in the room was complete, and Sarah realized that everything she had accomplished up to this point had been preparation for this single moment. The real test of her methods wasn't going to be individual performance improvements or impressive statistics. It was going to be whether she could convince a room full of Marines that a different way of thinking about training and performance was not just possible, but necessary. Sarah stood in front of the assembled Marines, feeling the weight of their collective skepticism. She had learned that Marines respected directness above all else, so she decided to abandon her prepared remarks and speak from the heart. 3 days ago, when I walked onto this base, I heard some of you laughing, she began, her voice steady and clear. You thought I looked like I belonged in a library, not a training ground. You were right about one thing. I did spend a lot of time in libraries, but what I learned there might surprise you. The room remained silent, but Sarah could sense a shift in attention. Marines were naturally curious about tactical advantages, and something in her tone suggested she was about to reveal intelligence that could be useful. I learned that the human body is the most sophisticated machine ever created, but most people, including elite warriors, only access about 30% of its true capabilities. I learned that the mind can override almost any physical limitation, but only if you understand how to program it correctly. Most importantly, I learned that the difference between good Marines and legendary Marines isn't just heart or courage. It's knowledge. Sergeant Rodriguez leaned forward slightly. The mention of legendary Marines had caught his attention, and Sarah noticed the subtle change in his posture. Let me show you what I mean, Sarah continued. Sergeant Rodriguez, would you mind helping me with the demonstration? Rodriguez looked to Captain Morgan, who nodded his approval. The sergeant stood and walked to the front of the room, his expression neutral but his eyes alert. "I want you to hold your arm straight out to your side," Sarah instructed. "Make a fist and resist when I try to push your arm down." Rodriguez extended his right arm, his muscles tensing as he prepared for the challenge. Sarah placed her hand on his wrist and applied downward pressure. Despite her small size, she was able to push his arm down with moderate effort, though Rodriguez was clearly resisting. "Okay, now I want you to do exactly the same thing, but this time, instead of thinking about resisting my push, I want you to imagine that your arm is a powerful beam of energy extending through the wall and out into the distance. Don't think about my hand at all. Just focus on that beam of energy." Rodriguez looked skeptical but nodded. He extended his arm again, and this time when Sarah applied pressure, his arm remained rock solid. She pressed harder, using both hands, but couldn't budge it. The difference was so dramatic that several Marines leaned forward to get a better look. "What just happened?" Sarah asked the room. "He got stronger somehow," offered Lance Corporal Thompson. "No," Sarah replied. "His physical strength didn't change at all, but his mental approach to the task changed everything. In the first attempt, he was thinking defensively, trying to resist an attack. In the second attempt, he was thinking offensively, projecting power outward. Same muscles, same situation, completely different result." The room was completely quiet now. Sarah had their attention in a way that no amount of credentials or explanations could have achieved.
"This isn't magic or psychology tricks," she continued.
"This is how your nervous system works. When you focus on avoiding failure, your body prepares for failure. When you focus on achieving success, your body prepares for success. The difference shows up in your muscle tension, your breathing, your balance, and your coordination." Corporal Washington raised his hand. "Ma'am, how does this apply to combat situations? Because we can't always control what we're thinking about when people are shooting at us." It was an excellent question, and Sarah had been hoping someone would ask it. Actually, you can control it, and the best warriors already do it instinctively. Think about the Marines, who stay calm under fire, who make good decisions in chaos. They're not thinking about all the ways they might get killed. They're focused on their mission, their teammates, and their next action. Sarah walked over to a whiteboard and began sketching simple diagrams of the human nervous system. Your body has two basic operating modes: survival mode and performance mode. Survival mode is great for dealing with immediate threats, but it shuts down your higher brain functions, reduces your coordination, and limits your strength to basic patterns. Performance mode keeps all your capabilities online and actually enhances them. She turned back to the Marines. Traditional military training is always focused on toughening people up so they can function despite being in survival mode. That works, but it's inefficient. What if we could teach people to stay in performance mode even under extreme stress? Captain Morgan spoke up for the first time. "Are you saying our training methods are wrong?" "Not wrong," Sarah replied carefully. "Incomplete. You've built incredibly tough, determined warriors. But toughness and determination are just the foundation. We can build on that foundation to create capabilities that go far beyond what anyone thought possible." She spent the next hour teaching the Marines basic techniques for managing their nervous system responses. She showed them breathing patterns that could shift them from survival mode to performance mode within seconds. She demonstrated movement exercises that could improve their coordination and reaction time. Most importantly, she taught them how to recognize when they were operating in survival mode so they could consciously shift back to performance mode. The techniques were simple enough to learn quickly, but sophisticated enough to produce immediate, measurable improvements. Within minutes, Marines were reporting that they felt more alert, more coordinated, and more confident. That the real test came when Captain Morgan announced that they would repeat their combat fitness evaluations using Sarah's techniques.
Every Marine in the unit would have the chance to see if these new methods actually translated into improved performance under pressure.
The test began at dawn the next morning. Sarah stood on the sidelines, watching as Marines moved through the various stations of the combat fitness test. Instead of the usual grunting, straining, and visible effort that typically characterized these evaluations, she saw something different. Marines moving with fluid efficiency, maintaining consistent breathing patterns, and staying mentally composed even when their bodies were under extreme stress. The results were unprecedented. The unit's average scores improved by 18%. More importantly, the Marines who had been struggling the most showed the greatest improvements. Private Chen, who had been failing the ammunition candidates just days earlier, achieved the highest score in the unit. Lance Corporal Thompson broke the unit record for the 3-mile run. Even Marines who had been performing well previously found themselves achieving personal bests. But Sarah noticed something even more significant than the improved test scores. The Marines were enjoying the challenge.
Instead of grimly enduring a necessary ordeal, they were approaching the test with confidence and curiosity. They were eager to see how well they could perform, rather than anxious about whether they would pass. After the test, Captain Morgan called Sarah aside for a private conversation. His expression was serious, but she could see respect in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "I don't know what you did to my Marines," he said, "but I've never seen results like this. These are the same men who were here a week ago, but they're performing like a completely different unit." "They are a different unit," Sarah replied. "Not because I changed them, but because they learned to access capabilities they already had. Every single improvement you saw today was potential that was already inside them." Morgan nodded slowly. "I need to understand something. These techniques you've taught us, are they going to work in actual combat? Because test scores are one thing, but when bullets start flying, everything changes." It was the question Sarah had been expecting, and she had an answer based on her previous work with SEAL teams who had used these methods in actual operations. "Captain, what I've taught your Marines isn't separate from combat performance. It's the foundation of combat performance. The ability to stay calm under pressure, to maintain coordination when exhausted, to make good decisions in chaos. These are exactly the capabilities that separate exceptional warriors from everyone else." She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "The SEALs I worked with before coming here have been using these methods in actual operations for 2 years. Their mission success rates improved, their casualty rates decreased, and their commanders started specifically requesting them for the most challenging assignments." This information seemed to surprise Morgan. "You've worked with SEAL teams?" "For the past 2 years, yes. Initially with candidates who were struggling in training, but eventually with active operational teams. The results were so consistent that the Navy asked me to develop training protocols for other special operations units." Morgan's respect for Sarah shifted into something approaching awe. In the Marine hierarchy, SEALs were regarded as elite among the elite. If they had validated her methods through actual combat operations, that changed everything. "Why didn't you mention this before?" he asked. "Because I wanted your Marines to evaluate my methods based on their own experience, not on reputation or credentials. The techniques work because they're based on how human performance actually functions, not because some other unit endorsed them." Over the following weeks, word of the dramatic improvements in Morgan's unit spread throughout Camp Pendleton. Other company commanders began requesting Sarah's assistance with their own training programs. The base commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Williams, scheduled a formal briefing to understand what was producing such remarkable results. Sarah found herself in the unprecedented position of having Marine officers compete for her time and attention. Units that had initially been skeptical were now requesting priority access to her training methods. The transformation had been so complete that she was having trouble keeping up with the demand. But the most significant validation came from an unexpected source. Word of Sarah's success had reached the Pentagon, where senior officers were always looking for any advantage that could improve the effectiveness of American forces. A formal request came down through channels. Sarah was being asked to brief the Joint Chiefs of Staff on her training methodology. The invitation represented both the ultimate validation of her work and the ultimate challenge. Convincing a single Marine unit to try new methods was one thing. Presenting to the highest levels of military leadership was something entirely different. As Sarah prepared for what might be the most important presentation of her career, she reflected on how much had changed since that first day when Marines had laughed at her appearance. She had proven that effectiveness wasn't about looking the part or following traditional patterns. It was about understanding how excellence actually worked and having the courage to pursue it regardless of what other people expected. The next phase of her journey would determine whether her revolutionary approach to human performance could transform not just individual units, but the entire military establishment. The stakes couldn't be higher, and Sarah knew that everything she had accomplished so far had been preparation for this moment. The Pentagon's corridors had intimidated world leaders, but as Sarah walked through the massive building toward the briefing room, she felt a calm confidence that surprised her. 6 months of working with Marines had taught her that respect was earned through results, not rank or reputation. Today, she would present those results to the most senior military leadership in the world. The briefing room was smaller than she had expected, with a polished mahogany table, surrounded by chairs that would soon hold the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of Defense, and several other officials whose decisions affected military operations worldwide. General Patricia Hayes, the Army Chief of Staff, was the first to arrive, followed by Admiral Richard Chen of the Navy and General Michael Torres from the Air Force. Sarah had spent weeks preparing for questions that never came. Instead of challenging her credentials or questioning her methods, these senior officers wanted to understand one thing.
Could her techniques be scaled up to transform entire military branches? And if so, how quickly could it be accomplished? General Hayes opened the discussion with characteristic directness. Ms. Martinez, we've reviewed the performance data from Camp Pendleton, and frankly, the improvements are unlike anything we've seen from any training innovation in the past decade. But we need to understand whether what worked with one Marine unit can work with hundreds of thousands of soldiers across multiple service branches. Sarah had anticipated this question and had prepared an answer based on her understanding of how human performance principles scaled across large organizations. General, the techniques I've developed are based on fundamental aspects of human physiology and psychology that don't change based on branch of service or size of unit. The challenge isn't whether they'll work at scale. The challenge is developing training systems that can teach these principles effectively to large numbers of people simultaneously. Admiral Chen leaned forward. Explain what you mean by training systems. Sarah opened her laptop and projected a presentation she had developed specifically for this meeting. Traditional military training has always focused on what to do, how to shoot, how to move, how to complete missions. But it hasn't taught people how to optimize their own performance while doing those things. My approach adds a layer of self-awareness and control that enhances everything else. She clicked to the next slide, which showed brain scans and performance metrics from her work with various units. When someone learns to manage their nervous system response, their accuracy improves, their strength increases, their reaction time decreases, and their decision-making under stress gets dramatically better. These aren't separate improvements. They're all aspects of the same underlying enhancement. General Torres, who had remained quiet during the initial discussion, asked the question that Sarah knew was coming. What's the training timeline? How long does it take to see results? Basic techniques can be learned in a single day and will produce immediate measurable improvements, Sarah replied. Advanced applications take several weeks of practice, but the performance gains continue to compound over months and years. The Marines at Camp Pendleton saw significant improvements within their first week of training. The room fell silent as the officers absorbed this information. Sarah understood that they were calculating not just the potential benefits, but the logistical challenges of implementing new training across military branches that employed millions of people. Secretary of Defense James Morrison, who had been reviewing documents throughout the presentation, looked up with the expression of cautious optimism. Ms. Martinez, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need a direct answer. In your professional opinion, could these methods provide American forces with a measurable advantage in combat operations? Sarah had been preparing for this moment since she first began working with military personnel. Secretary, based on my work with SEAL teams who have used these methods in actual operations, I believe these techniques represent the most significant advancement in human performance training since the development of modern physical fitness protocols. The question isn't whether they provide an advantage. The question is whether we can afford not to implement them. Her confidence in making such a bold statement was based on data that even she found remarkable. SEAL teams using her methods had completed missions with success rates that exceeded historical averages by significant margins. More importantly, their casualty rates had decreased dramatically, suggesting that the enhanced performance wasn't just about completing objectives, but about keeping American warriors alive in dangerous situations. General Hayes asked for specifics, and Sarah provided them. Mission completion rates had improved by an average of 20 to 3%. Combat injuries not related to enemy action had decreased by 41%. Perhaps most significantly, the psychological stress indicators that typically led to long-term combat trauma showed marked improvement among personnel trained in her methods. These numbers suggest that your training doesn't just make people better warriors, Admiral Chen observed. It makes them more resilient human beings. That's exactly right, Sarah confirmed. The same principles that enhance physical performance also improve emotional regulation, stress management, and psychological recovery. We're not just optimizing people for combat, we're optimizing them for life. The discussion continued for 3 hours, with questions that ranged from scientific methodology to implementation logistics to budgetary considerations. Sarah found herself explaining complex neuroscience concepts to some of the most experienced military leaders in the world, and she was impressed by their grasp of the implications. The turning point came when General Torres asked about pilot training. The Air Force had been struggling with a phenomenon where highly qualified pilots would sometimes freeze or make poor decisions during extreme combat maneuvers, despite having excellent technical skills and extensive training. Sarah explained that these performance breakdowns were classic examples of nervous system responses overwhelming conscious control.
The pilots had the knowledge and skills to handle the situations, but their bodies were shifting into survival mode, which limited their access to higher brain functions. Using the techniques I've developed, she explained, pilots can learn to maintain full cognitive function even during the most stressful flight situations. They can access their complete skill set when they need it most, instead of being limited to basic survival responses. This application resonated deeply with General Torres, whose pilots were regularly operating in situations where split-second decisions could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure.
The possibility of enhancing pilot performance without requiring additional flight hours or new equipment was particularly attractive given budget constraints. Secretary Morrison called for a brief recess, during which the senior officers huddled in private conversation.